Well, I am Pablo Perez Ramos. I am assistant professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the GSD. And on behalf of the chairs of the department chair, Anita Berrizbeitia, who cannot be here today, she sends her regrets. It is a pleasure for me to introduce this afternoon's event, which is part of a series of events that are going to take place here at the GSD this week with the occasion of the International Women's Week. And in fact, I think this is the first one of that series, so it will help us, in a way, set the tone of other events that are going to come. If you want to know about those, you should check the Women in Design student group website. They're doing a fantastic work. But before I introduce our speaker, I need to announce a couple of upcoming events here at the GSD. Tomorrow, March 3rd, environmental activist and scientist Dr. Vandana Shiva will deliver the 2020 International Women's Day keynote lecture here at the GSD in Piper at 6:30 p.m. Next Tuesday, March the 10th, senior Loeb scholars Nikolai Uruzov, Florencia Rodriguez, and Thomas Weaver will come together for a conversation with Dean Sarah Whiting entitled Words Build Worlds, also in Piper at 6:30. And on Friday, March the 13th, the GSD will host a one-day conference entitled On the Scene, New Approaches to Building the American Museum of Natural History, also in Piper, beginning at 10 a.m. But today, I am here to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Hoover, who will be giving us a lecture on seed sovereignty and our living relatives in Native American community farming and gardening. By food security, it's a term that we are all already familiar with, we normally mean the possibility of individuals, of communities, to have access to enough food and to food of enough quality to meet dietary needs for a healthy life. Food sovereignty, which is the topic of today's lecture, goes one step further and looks into the ways in which food has been produced, asking whether the food that we have access to has been cultivated in a way that is safe for both the land and the farmers. In the context of indigenous communities, which are the subject of today's lecture, food sovereignty itself goes yet another step further, for it incorporates the importance of culturally relevant food, food that is tied to the language and the cultural reclamation of these communities. Our speaker today, who grew up in a little farm in upstate New York, surrounded by what she calls those edible friends, was going to be a farmer herself, but ended up being an anthropologist that works with farmers. She has driven more than 20,000 miles around the country, Canada, Central America, visiting and interviewing Native American farmers, investigating their concerns about funding needed for farming, their lack of land to farm, the contamination of that land, and the impact that farming practices of multinational corporations have on their heirloom seeds, which these communities see as their living relatives, and whose introduction on the land they see, as Elizabeth will explain in a moment, as the foundation of their food sovereignty movement. This work, Elizabeth's work, is ultimately concerned with the environmental, the social, and the cultural questions that raise from the intersection of food studies with Native American and Indigenous studies. And since most of us don't use our own land and our own labor to grow the food we eat, one of the questions that we are being asked today is, how are we supporting or condemning the people and the land that grow that food for us? Elizabeth Hoover is Associate Professor of American Studies at Brown University, where she also serves as the faculty chair of Brown's Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative Steering Committee. Her first book, The River Is in Us, Fighting Toxics in a Mohawk Community, of 2017, is an ethnographic exploration of a Mohawk community in upstate New York and the response to Superfund contamination and environmental health research. Her second book, a project already in progress, is titled From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, Indigenizing the Local Food Movement, and will explore a Native American community-based farming and gardening project, the ways in which people are defining and enacting concepts like food sovereignty and seed sovereignty, the role of native chefs in the food movement, and the fight against the fossil fuel industry to protect heritage foods. She also recently has co-edited a book called Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States with Devon Mijeswa, and has published articles about Native American food sovereignty and seed rematriation, environmental reproductive justice in Native American communities, the cultural impact of fish advisories on Native communities, and tribal citizen science. Outside of academia, Elizabeth serves on the executive committee of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance and the board of North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Hoover to the podium.
Well, thank you for that gracious introduction, and welcome everybody. I want to thank the Indigenous people whose land we are sitting on right now, the Massachusetts Wampanoag and other folks. I hope you keep them in mind while you're traversing about their territory when you're going through your daily activities. Yes, so today I am an anthropologist by training, and I work in an American Studies department, so I'm really interested to hear how the work that I've been doing is then perhaps relevant to your own design work. So I want to start by talking about food sovereignty. And as my gracious introducer mentioned, it's the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to defend their own food and agriculture systems. And so this is a definition that La Via Campesina first came up with in 1996. They're an international peasant organization, and then this was developed at the Declaration of Naileni in 2007, which was a gathering in Mali that brought together 500 delegates from 80 different countries trying to figure out how to promote and support food sovereignty in their own nations. And throughout this presentation, these are all photos that I took along the adventure, so I'm happy also at the end to answer any questions about those. But this is Kenny Perkins' hands unwrapping a Mohawk red bread corn in this photo here. But in thinking about food sovereignty and where this falls on the spectrum of research and concerns around developing food policy, food security, you know, the WHO wants to make sure everybody is getting enough calories to sustain you on the regular. Are you getting enough calories? Are you getting enough food into your household as an individual on a daily basis? The food justice movement kind of went a step above that and said it's not just enough that we're getting food dropped and delivered to us. We want to make sure people have equal access to safe, healthy food, that there are assurances that workers within the food system are treated fairly, and this is everyone from farm workers to restaurant workers and everyone in between, and accounting for the value of food in relation to the self-determination of communities. So essentially making sure that there is equality within the current system. Is everyone getting sufficient access to the current system? And the food sovereignty movement kind of says, well, maybe we don't want your system. So Winona LaDuke has said in presentations, we don't just want a piece of the pie, we want a totally different pie. So thinking about how can a community, a nation, a tribal nation specifically in these examples, not just have equality within the current system, but have control over your own system. So getting back to the, making sure that you have culturally relevant food and you have control over how that food was produced. So this is a nationwide, this is a global movement, each of these different nations trying to figure this out. And in thinking about specifically for Indigenous communities wrestling with what is food sovereignty, recognizing the social, cultural, and economic relationships that underlie community food sharing that need to be nurtured, and that those sacred relationships, that they're nurtured, and the relationships to land-based food and political systems. And so it's really about the relationships between all of the different communities that are needed to sustain your human community. So thinking about the context and meaning of the term community as not just who are the humans that you relate to on the daily basis, but who are the plant communities, the fish communities, birds, and others that make your survival something that can be maintained. So a whirlwind, one-slide history of settler colonialism in North America. Why is it that Native communities are fighting so hard to regain food sovereignty? Why was food sovereignty lost? Why is this such a problem and a movement? It starts with scorched earth battle tactics, especially here on the East Coast. So for Haudenosaunee people, the Marquis de Denonville and French folks came through in 1687, and as a way of weakening Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people, set fire to cornfields. If you want to weaken people, you destroy their food sources. And so this has been a tenor of interactions between people on this continent since settler folks came here. It's if you want to weaken folks, you destroy their food. Sullivan's campaign in 1779 came through and did the same thing again. And so this is why the word for president in most Haudenosaunee languages, so in Mohawk is Lananagayas, means town destroyer. So there have been a series of town destroyers, and the first one was named as such because the food sources, the crops, the orchards, the storages of food were intentionally set fire because many of the Haudenosaunee nations did not immediately join with the Americans as part of the American Revolution. There was the destruction of buffalo herds in the 19th century as a way of starving out tribes onto reservations. For Navajo people, there was a long walk in the 1860s, and people who did not relocate, Kit Carson and his men burned their sheep and their crops. So that's kind of the first reason. Why aren't people food sovereign? Well, there was an intentional effort over hundreds of years to make sure that Indigenous communities could not be food sovereign. The Allotment Act, or also called the Dawes Act in 1887, so this is after tribes have, many of which have been put onto reservations. Those land bases are shrunk through the Allotment Act, which took community-held land and divvied it up into individual parcels, and then the extra land was sold to settlers. So that further reduced land bases and made it harder for tribal nations to feed themselves. Boarding schools from the 1870s up to the 1950s. Here on the East Coast, it was even earlier than the 1870s, but kids were forcibly removed from their families to be re-educated in these schools so they would be more assimilable. And as part of that, they were not taught traditional ways of farming and gathering and producing food. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is the BIA, throughout the 19th century and onward, really promoted Western farming methods. So went to reservations after they had been shrunk and said, look, the only way you're going to be able to support yourselves and feed yourselves is if you farm the way we tell you. Now, people like the Pueblo had been farming for thousands and thousands of years quite successfully using dry land farming methods. And the BIA said, no, use these seeds, use these irrigation methods, which then eventually failed. And then they said, oh, maybe you were doing something right. Well, yes, it doesn't sustain people for thousands of years if it wasn't working. But there was a Western model of farming that included plows and irrigation and hybrid seeds that didn't work in many communities, and at the same time made it so that people were not passing along their farming traditions. Throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, you had people going around and collecting seeds from Native communities that then developed their own seed companies and made those into hybrid seeds. So people recognized the value of seeds at the same time as they were pushing hybrid seeds onto communities. Contemporary challenges, so a lot of these are kind of, the 17th century on up through the early 20th century. Now people who are working to still maintain and regain traditional farming practices are dealing with climate change, which is making it challenging to know from one spring to the next whether it's going to be cold and rainy, whether it's going to be dry and hot. That makes it hard to guess how your farming is going to go. There's concern about cross-contamination with the pollen from genetically modified seeds, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's a lot of access to land, tool, and seed issues. So as I mentioned, land bases have really shrunk. So sometimes when people are interested in starting up big farms again, that's hard to do if you don't have access to land. And some people, farming is hard work. It's not for everybody. And some people just want to be able to go buy food and not have to put a lot of work into it, which, not everybody has to be a farmer, but some people have to be excited about it, right? All right, so what have been then the impacts of this kind of couple hundred years of disaster? Prior to 1940, you had very few cases of type 2 diabetes in Native communities. Now it's the 7th leading cause of death for Native people, who are 249% more likely than other American folks to die of diabetes-related complications. You see, this is a poster from the Osage Community Center. Do you think he ate pizza and pop for lunch? Of course not, and he didn't have diabetes either. So trying to get people to think about how are their diets now very different from what their ancestors ate and what are the physical outcomes of that. There are also economic issues that come out of this. So the White Earth Land Recovery Project did a survey of their community on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, and they found that the community members spend $8 million a year on food, $7 million of which is spent off reservation. So like, wow, how do we get those dollars to stay here in the community? All right, so you feel the energy in the room right now. It's pretty grim. Y'all are real quiet and grim looking, and rightfully so. So we start with the grim part, because you have to know this important history. But if any of you have read any of Eve Tuck's work, and she talks about not just doing damage-based research, but desire-based research. So clearly Indian people have not just laid down and given up and died, despite all of these centuries of effort to that end, but people are constantly thinking about how do we address these issues? How do we fix these problems? And so that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this, is how are Native communities responding to centuries of challenge and to upcoming challenges and the health issues that have come out of that. And I'm going to focus specifically on farming and gardening projects, because this is what I love. And so I got thinking about these issues when I was living in Akwesasne, and I was working with a group called Ganahio Yunguaya Dohage, which is We Are Planting Good Seeds. And this is a community-based organization that is working to try to get people back into farming and gardening and seed saving and working collectively. So there's a community greenhouse where people are starting plants. This is Jean and Henry with their chickens that they were working on as part of this project. Some kids from the Akwesasne Freedom School picking white corn, which is an important food crop there. And so as part of working with folks in the garden and pulling weeds and butchering chickens and doing all these things that you need to do to keep fed, we'd be thinking at night, how are other communities doing this? How are people getting funding for these kind of projects? How are they getting youth involved? How are you getting more community members to come and do this work? And so asking all of these questions led me to start going to these different food summits and meeting people from other kinds of communities who are doing this work. And so then I was like, I don't want to just see people's PowerPoints about these projects. I want to go visit these farms and talk to people in person. And so then I jumped in the car and drove 20,000 miles around the country over about 4 months and went to 40 different communities and asked people, how are you managing these kinds of projects? And as part of that, I started this blog called From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, Indigenizing the Local Food Movement, because those of you familiar with academia know that the publishing process is painfully slow. Like, I'm still working on the book. It's 2020. It's hopefully going to be done soon. People did not want to wait a decade to see things in print. They were like, I want to go travel around and see what everybody else is up to. So the blog was a way of letting everybody else know what each other was working on. So people who could not just go traipsing around the whole country for months on end because they had to stay and weed the garden and pick the wild rice and get all the kids involved, could go and kind of see what everybody else was up to. And so some of the questions that I was asking people at these projects were, for your community-based organization, how would have been some of the successes and challenges? How do you define food sovereignty for yourselves? How do you decide what qualifies as an heirloom seed? Is it any old seed? Does it have to be passed down in a particular way? So people had different definitions for this. Where do you get your funding? Is there funding that you won't pursue or accept? So some people were like, no, we cannot decolonize if we are taking U.S. federal dollars to do it. That is just not how it works. And other people were like, I will take your dirty Walmart money and I will spend it on all of my tools and crops and I will be happy about it. So people had very different attitudes about what kind of funds could go into this kind of thing. And so I'm happy to talk about all of these other themes later, but today I'm going to focus specifically on this question of heirloom seeds, indigenous seeds, heritage seeds. How does that work in some communities? So I want to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of adventures that seeds have been on. So some seeds have always just been in their communities, as people describe it. So this was in Cochiti, New Mexico, Cochiti Pueblo, that I went to visit. my friend Ade Romero had been talking a lot about this project that she had helped started, the Cochiti Youth Enrichment Project, which partners youth with farmers to spend the summer out on the land learning how to plant corn and beans and squashes, and to get into this in the hopes of trying to get youth excited and involved. And this is her cousin Jason, who gave me a tour around and introduced me to his grandma Percy, who was really like the lady in the family who decides each year which corn gets kept as seed. So what goes into the soup pot, what gets used for the different feast days and graduations and birthdays and all the various sort of ceremonies. You need corn for all of these holidays. So it was very important to Jason that he be able to grow enough corn for the women in his family to be able to do these kinds of activities. And, introducing us. And these corns were just hanging around her house like relatives. They're on tables, they're kind of on coffee tables, they're hanging on the wall, and they're just part of the family in there. And he talked about how, she really likes some of these kind of metallic colors. So when she, when the time is right and she's husking them off there and she's saying plant this and don't plant this and we're going to eat this, she is then deciding what the next generation of seed for that family is going to look like. And generations onward, like each grandma who's deciding what gets planted when is going to be, leaving her mark and her touch on there. And as far as Jason knows, like this corn has just always been around. Like his family's just always been there. It's always been around. Some seeds kind of go on adventures and journeys and take a little while to come home. So this is a prodigal squash that came back to Taos during a native food summit. So Rowan White, who's in the red shawl there, is the chair of the board for the Seed Savers Exchange. She's a Mohawk seed keeper who also works for the Indigenous Seed Keepers Company, or Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. And they asked her to be the chair of the board of Seed Savers, and she noticed when she was looking through all their records, this is a huge seed operation, that there were at least 1,000 seeds that people had donated over the years that had indigenous roots. And she said, I want to grow these seeds out and send them back to the indigenous communities they were collected from. And so as part of a summit that was hosted by the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, she brought back some of these orange squashes. And you see these women here, they had tears in their eyes. They welcomed it home it was like a baby. They held it like a baby, and they welcomed home this squash that had been gone for a bit and then returned to them. And they were glad to kind of have this relative come home. And so that sort of demonstrates kind of the different ends of the spectrum of some seeds stay right where they are, and some go and hang out in collections for a long time and come back. And we're going to talk more about that as part of the seed rematriation. So in thinking about heirloom crops and memory and how social scientists have thought about why people grow heirloom crops. So if you go to any farmer's market, there's heirloom tomatoes, and now you can charge $1 a pound more for an heirloom tomato. But beyond that, what compels people to want to grow an heirloom crop and not just some other kind of seed out of a Burpee seed catalog? So Virginia Nazaria is an anthropologist, and she's done a lot of work looking at heirloom seeds and their keepers in countries all over the world. And she talks about the reattachments of stories and memories of food and how that's really important for the world's biodiversity. And how heirloom crops play a central role in the restoration of landscapes of remembrance. So how are people being very intentional when planting their gardens and saying, I want this garden to reflect some kind of remembrances that my grandmother has, or that people from the country that my grandmother came from, how can that garden reflect their experience? Jennifer Jordan wrote a whole book about heirloom crops and how do we define that. And she talks about edible memory. So infusing food with connections to the past, both deeply personal and inherently social. So thinking about how food has a unique quality to carry the personal and social meanings. So when people pass on heirloom seeds, they're giving you these seeds that have genes that are being passed on. So that tomato that you're planting is going to come out very similar to the one your grandma planted and her grandma planted. But also beyond that, there's something about consuming other people's memories. So the assumption that when you cook with that particular vegetable or that particular fruit, that you are consuming something that all of these women who came before you, or men, I'm kind of women-centered in my seed talk, but men save seed too. But looking at the demographics here today, I think you'll be all right. But thinking about the memories, whose memories are you consuming when you're planting those seeds that have been connected to your family in some way? And then Alison Landsberg talks about prosthetic memory. So even thinking about trying to get access to a memory through that taste, through that plant that maybe hasn't even been directly passed on to you. And so I'm going to talk about Deb Echohawk and the Pawnee Seed Project in a little bit. But she worked for years and years to bring back a corn variety, a bunch of corn varieties, but one in particular. And she really wanted her people to be able to have this particular corn as part of their corn soup. And the first year they finally had enough seed to make soup. It went so fast she didn't get any. But she's gone to eat some since. But just to work, what does it mean to work so hard for a seed, for a crop, and you don't even know what it tastes like? But you're assuming, based on your relatives' insistence that this crop had the right to be there, that it's going to be amazing. So, but how are we deciding what is a heritage seed, an heirloom seed, an indigenous seed? So I decided, I went out and I asked people who were planting these kind of crops. And some people said, well, it's decided on as a community. Like, well, everybody in our community wants to plant this, or we decided this is the corn that represents our community. Ken Parker, who was working with the Seneca community, said, we have beans that are specific to our tribe. You need to say, this is our special bear bean or blue corn. And every year people consciously save those seeds and give them to their neighbor. Other people talked about how it's an heirloom seed or heritage seed if it's passed down through families. So it had to specifically say in families. So Lillian Hill, who works with the Hopi-Tutsqua permaculture, described, I think a heritage or an heirloom seed are varieties that have been within families or within communities for several generations. They become part of the food tradition and they become part of our culture. And so those are what really define heritage or heirloom seed, or the old varieties we've had in our community for a long time. And they have names in our traditional language. And they're not only used nutrition-wise, but they're also very important culturally and ceremonial. So those are the seeds we've had for a long time, and they're very special and sacred to us. And they're not only heritage and heirloom, meaning they've been with families for many generations, but they're also related to us. They're our relatives. We see corn as our mother, and so we're related. We see these seeds as being our relatives, and they're very important to us. So thinking about how they've been passed down through family and become family at the same time. People also talked about, well, they've had songs and ceremonies attached to them and sung over them. So for some people, it wasn't enough that it just had the name attached. So there's a seed bank in the Southwest that has a whole lot of different kinds of seeds. And one of the organizations I was visiting was critical of that and said, well, just because you have a Hopi seed or an O'odham seed and you call it that, if it's non-native people that are growing them out every year and putting them back in the seed bank and you haven't been singing to them and you haven't been praying over them, then I don't think they may be sort of related to our seeds, but you can't consider them in the same way. They haven't been given the same ceremony and treatment, so that was important for some communities. For other people, it was the cultural context that went with those seeds, that, there are ceremonies that require specific kinds of food, and those kinds of, corns or beans need to be part of that food. The genes are connected to your ancestors. So you see Glenda's got a whole handful of this Bear Island flint corn. So every time you hold one of these ears of corn, you are holding the decisions that have been made by all these generations of seed keepers before you. So what makes that corn cob long or short, and the particular colors and the particular flavors are all as the result of decisions made by all of these subsequent seed keepers. So being reconnected with those seeds reconnects you then with all of those people that came before you who were part of making those decisions. But at the same time, Rowan at the bottom of your seed, it shouldn't be static. So Rowan talks about how you also have to, each year as you're selecting, saying, which ones does our community right now think are delicious? Which ones are growing the best right now? Because sometimes people get a seed back and they want to preserve it just exactly as it is, and they don't want to introduce any other kinds of, like for corn, for example, it's very easy to have inbred or bottlenecked corn if you have a small population and you never bring in other genetics. So thinking about how do you also keep them current? So why is it important to plant and save these seeds? It's so much easier just to go to a seed catalog and just order your seeds every year. Why are people so compelled to try to locate these seeds and hang on to them and bring them back? Some people talked about how it establishes a cultural connection to planting. So it gives you that extra layer of meaning. So this is the Dream of Wild Health Farm in Minnesota, and they got back, they're on Dakota territory, and they were able to get back a type of Dakota flint corn that nobody had been growing for a long time from a project that I'll talk about in a little bit. And they felt like it was especially important to put Dakota corn on that Dakota land to reconnect to the land and the seed, that they belong together in that way. And now they've been able to grow out enough of this kind of corn that Dakota elders are eating this cornmeal again, and not just, store brand kinds of cornmeal. That there's a ceremonial context. So again, as I've mentioned, there are particular dishes that you need, and you have to have the right kind of varieties of seed to do that. And reestablishing connections to ancestors. So this, as part of this youth program at Dream Wild Health, they previously had an elder in residence there who said, well, I'm telling the kids as they're planting this corn that they're reconnecting with those people who helped to create this corn. People see it as more nutritious than a lot of the conventional varieties that are available, and they like that it gives them this independence from industrial agriculture. So there's a sense of, if I know how to save seeds, if I have these seeds that have been created for my community, I'm not reliant on this outside entity that might decide at some point to stop selling seeds or is unable to. So in thinking about the broader seed sovereignty movement, and I'm quite honored to be speaking ahead of Vandana Shiva, who sounds like will be coming shortly. So she's really been one of the main proponents and international voices of seed sovereignty. But a big part of it is thinking about the importance of farmers' rights to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-raised seeds. So the ability of corn, for farmers to be able to do that, as opposed to right now, the law really sides with intellectual property rights and plant breeders' rights. So it's really a resistance to the monopolization of seed, the ability of communities to be able to have access to their seed and exchange it as they see appropriate. Since the 1930s, farmer sovereignty over seed broadly in this country and kind of in the world has really decreased, while the sovereignty of the life sciences industry has increased. So with the ability, especially after the 1980s, to patent seeds and to add genetic use restriction technologies, which are also called terminator technologies. So you buy a seed from a company, you plant it. If you were to try to save any of that seed, it will not, that comes from the next generation, it will not sprout. And so there is this feature that's added so that it makes it impossible for people to replant seeds. And so Vandana Shiva and Jack Kloppenberg are two folks that have really been very vocal on an international scale about the importance of seed sovereignty, the importance of, farmers for several eons now have gotten by being able to save their own seed and create their own varieties. And so in thinking about how are some of the indigenous folks talking about seed sovereignty? This is Clayton Brockapay, who founded the Traditional Native American Farmers Association. And when I asked him, okay, how do you define seed sovereignty when you're working with different farmers and seed keepers? And he said, to me, seed sovereignty means the control of your seeds. So if you think about it in a different manner, we refer to these seeds as our living relatives. So we have to have control and ability to protect our living relatives. So they can't be molested or contaminated or imprisoned. When I say imprisoned, I mean perhaps someone will say, this is some interesting stuff, and they grow it for a few years, and all of a sudden they say they own it. That's the protection of our living relative. If not, then somebody else may say they owned it, and they're imprisoned, and you can't go visit and plant your relative. Also, if you have the ability to interact with your relatives through these seeds, you have the ability to feed yourself well. Nobody is dictating what you could be eating. And so it's thinking about seeds in a very different way, that he's saying you wouldn't let somebody cut them open on a genetic level, you wouldn't let somebody patent your relatives, so we're going to protect our seed relatives from this similar fate. And then Rowan, who's another very active person in this field, talks about being able to define our relationship to that seed dependent on our own values and not the value of anybody else outside of our community. So there's really been a big push. The two of them have done a lot of classes in different communities about how do you save seed, how do you select seed, how do you, plant gardens and these kinds of things. There's been increasing effort on community levels of developing seed banks. So Tesuque Pueblo has this amazing cob house seed bank to be able to have a storehouse right there in the community, so if something happens, people can go there and get their seed. There's one corner, of the bank in Gun Lake Potawatomi community of Jijak, a project there. And so there's been this effort, and so some people are like, oh, but there's the Svalbard seed vault, and there's, the USDA has a seed bank, and people are like, I don't know if we want to send them all over creation. Maybe we just want to keep them right here and have them local and available. And the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, I've mentioned them a few times, is an organization funded through, in part, the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance that has been working with communities all over the U.S., Indigenous communities, around doing a seed sovereignty assessment. Okay, what kinds of seeds do you have available? Who do you need to share with? Who do you need to contact to get access to different seeds? And they've created these. It started as the Upper Midwest Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, and they created these envelopes as a way of kind of a spin on, I don't know if many of you have ever bought a giant bag of GMO corn, but there's a bag tag principle to it. So once you pull that tag off, you're basically agreeing to all the rules and laws that are applicable to that corn. So after that, if you decide to sell it or save it in a way that's inappropriate, they say, well, no, you knew because you agreed to it when you ripped that tag off. And so there's a statement on the little flap of this seed envelope saying, if you use these seeds, you're agreeing to treat them in this particular way and respect them in this way and not try to patent them or genetically alter them. So it's sort of a spin on that particular approach to protecting seeds, for what it's worth. So as I mentioned, some seeds have really kind of hunkered down and hung out at home for their entire lineage, and some have gone on these grand adventures, and people have worked to find them and bring them home. And so you probably heard of the term repatriation, which is often used, especially through the context of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in the 90s as a way of trying to get institutions that receive federal funding to give back to Native communities ancestral remains, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony. So it said that, okay, you need to send those things back. So it's seen as this kind of one-way process. You took something you should not have, and now you need to send it back home, and then communities can decide the fate of those ancestors or those objects from there. But in thinking about, people decide, we're like, repatriation is such a patriarchal sounding word. How do we expand on that? How do we recognize the important role of women seed keepers throughout history and in this movement, and come up with something that feels a little more circular? So the idea of rematriation reconnects Indigenous people to those seeds that have gone on adventures and maybe in other places. It reconnects those seeds back to their motherland, which they were originally developed for and where they belong. And in the process also reconnects Indigenous people to the land as part of bringing those seeds home and replanting them. So that's the basic idea behind rematriation. And so to give you some examples of some rematriation projects that have been going on around the country, this is the Science Museum of Minnesota. Scott Shoemaker is a Miami curator. He is now down at the Eiteljorg, but at the time that I went to visit him, he was working on this project with the Science Museum. And the museum had an ethnobotany collection, a majority of which, these were seeds collected by dentist/anthropologist named Wesley Hiller in the 30s. So people had all the jobs back then. You could just be a dentist and an anthropologist, and that was fine. But he was just sort of fascinated with Native people and collected all these things, including a whole lot of seeds, lots of corn, beans, squash, tobaccos, sunflowers. And when he died in the 70s, his collection was donated to the museum. And then it was in the early 2000s, there was a local seed guy named Paul Red Oak who said, maybe we should try to germinate some of these seeds. Like, what is the point of keeping these little living things just sort of stored away on this shelf, hanging out to slowly dissecate? And it was a challenge to convince the museum, because museums are not designed to just be like, here, yes, take this thing out of our collection and stick it in the ground and let it change or rot or disappear entirely. But they use the gardens on site for the museum to educate the public about native agriculture. So this is Scott by one of the Three Sisters gardens here. He came on in 2009, and they started working with local organizations of how do we get some of these seeds back to the communities that this dentist anthropologist originally collected them from. And so this here at Dream of Wild Health, this is a bean. The seeds were 80 years old, and that was the one that sprouted. So that's why it's got a whole wire cage thing around it, and everybody goes and peers at it periodically, and there's like these do not eat signs near it. But that was how that Dakota corn that I mentioned previously went back to Dream of Wild Health, and now there's enough corn that people are eating it when nobody had had access to that seed before. So it was an important way for that museum to recognize the importance of having some of that seed go back out into the world to do its job as a seed should. I mentioned already the Seed Savers Exchange, where the squash went back to Taos. There was a gathering a few summers ago. These are all different seed keepers that came and to the Dream of Wild Health farm to visit some of the different crops that were being grown out and sent back to the different communities. And then those in the background, those are the shelves where a lot of their beans and seeds are stored for sale. Then we have the University of Michigan that's collaborating with the Zibuing Center and MACPRA, which is the Michigan Anishinaabe Cultural Preservation and Repatriation Alliance. And MACPRA and the University of Michigan had some contentious relationships over the years with about the repatriation of ancestors, but as part of like, okay, what have you all got in there? They found out that there's also all these different seeds, and so now there's this collaboration garden that's happening there over at the Botanical Gardens, and so the Botanical Gardens is going to collaborate with these communities and the museum to get people involved again in thinking about how to grow out some of those seeds and again get them back to the communities. And this is the Hudson Valley Farm Hub and Seed Shed, are organizations in the Hudson Valley and New York who have partnered with Akwesasne Mohawks. And this is an example where the native folks brought the seed back to land that they had initially farmed for a very long time before being driven up north by settlers. And it was kind of a win-win in the sense that there was this pipeline that was scheduled to come through, and people were like, how do we make this a place that people really don't want to dig up for a pipeline at the same time as we've got all this lush, gorgeous soil here. So that corn in the background is the red bread corn, the first one they started with. And that came down to one cob. And seed keeper Steve McCumber had that cob and he grew it out a bit, but there still wasn't very much of it. And they grew a lot of it on this land, and 2,000 pounds of red corn went back to Akwesasne that was then used for seed and for food as part of the Ohologo rites of passage. So it's been an important way of reconnecting people whose land that originally was with farmers in that area who recognized they're settler farmers on somebody else's homeland. And then I mentioned previously Deb Echohawk and the Pawnee Seed Preservation Project. The Pawnee were originally in Nebraska. They were forcibly relocated in the 1870s down to Oklahoma. According to Deb, who has those amazing braids you see in the left picture there, they go all the way to her knees. She's quite stunning. She said there were originally 12,000 Pawnees, and then when they got to Oklahoma, there were 684. So she said we lost a lot of knowledge keepers, we lost whole families, and a lot of the seed. People didn't have the chance to properly pack up their seed, and they lost a lot of that seed. The seed wouldn't grow well. So in the 1980s, she started to get concerned about like how much of our original seed is out there. She started putting a call out to the community. They also had some bundles, some sacred bundles that were repatriated from a historical society, and there were seeds in those bundles. And they worked hard to try to grow things out in Oklahoma, and they're like, our seeds don't like our soil. They want to go back to that nice, thick, loamy soil that the Nebraska farmers are so fond of. And she ended up partnering with Ronnie O'Brien. You see they're laughing together there. And for several years, so Ronnie is a Nebraska farmer who had been working for the Great Platte River Road Archway in Kearney, Nebraska, and they have kind of all of this celebratory settler history activities there. And people were like, this place had a history before the 1840s, and so she's like, oh yeah, we need to do a better job representing that history prior to all these farmers. And so she kept reaching out to the Pawnee, and they end up collaborating there, and they now work with a lot of farmers in Nebraska to grow out some of these different prize corns that weren't doing well in Oklahoma. And so now there's 17 gardeners and one farmer growing out corn for the Pawnee folks on their original homeland. And this is a similar story in the Ponca replanting corn in Nebraska. So it was 1877 when the Ponca were relocated out of Nebraska, and they were relocated in May right after they had planted all of their corn. Soldiers came, rounded everybody up, and the cornfields got left behind. And this is Amos, who worked for a bit for the agriculture program there. And he was interested, he's down in Oklahoma in the other Pawnees, and now there's a Pawnee in Nebraska and there's a Pawnee in Oklahoma, and he's wondering what happened to all the seeds that Ponca used to have. And he's reading all of these folks who were writing in the 19th century, and he decides to try to track them down. And so he gets some back from Deb, who was doing her Pawnee seed work, and he gets in touch on the interwebs, and he's just asking corn seed folks everywhere. And there were particular corns that he really wanted to track down, and there was a corn breeder in Minnesota who wrote back to him and said, I got this corn from a Dakota lady. It's been in her family for a while. Maybe that was them who came down and picked your corn that time when it all got abandoned there. And he started pulling out kernels that looked like what Amos was looking for. Because genes can hide in corn in funny ways. Each one of those corn kernels, when you think of the silk on the top of the corn, each one of those silks has to get its own pollen. And so basically a cob of corn is like a whole bunch of siblings. Each one has a different dad or the same dad. You don't know. They come out all different colors. But corn is fascinating in that way. And the genes can really kind of, in the same way that you might have blue eyes pop up in your family and you're like, whoa, where'd that come from? Corn does that all the time. You're like, look at that purple kernel. And so he just kept pulling out the kernels that were what Amos was looking for until now they have whole cobs that look like the varieties that they lost when they were forcibly relocated. And so this land right here is where the Keystone Pipeline is supposed to come through. So April 2014, the Cowboy and Indian Alliance, you had ranchers that were like, we don't want a pipeline. And the native folks are like, well, we don't want a pipeline. It's going to ruin all the land and the water. They went to D.C. I don't know if you remember that ride. And then the following spring, they're like, we should come together and plant corn in the path of this pipeline is another way of saying you shall not cross through here unless you're going to dig up all the sacred corn that it took us 150 years to get back. So now every year people go and they plant corn, and actually in 2018 the Tanderups deeded this corn plot to both the Ponca of Nebraska and the Ponca of Oklahoma. So now to get that pipeline through, they'll have to deal with another set of landowners who now have land in that way. And then the final story, I just get so excited about this guy. The Field Museum. I don't know if anybody has ever been to the Field Museum in Chicago. The North American halls had not been changed in a very long time, since the 1950s. And so the museum put together a committee of folks to think about how to reshape that. And they said, will you be on this committee? And I was like, another committee. I was like, but they have seeds in this museum. So I said, sure. And then I said, where's the seeds? And they said, lady, this is not a seed bank. This is not how things work in a museum. I said, okay, but can I see the seeds? And so the funny thing about how museums work is they're very siloed, right? So anthropology has collections, and there's geology, and the birds go here, and then the economic botany, the seeds here. But there were seeds in economic botany, and there's seeds in anthropology. And the reason why there are seeds in the anthropology collection is because William Jones was the first native guy to get a PhD in anthropology. And this was at the very end of the 1800s, early 1900s. And he was Sac and Fox from Oklahoma. And he goes to work for the Field Museum, and they sent him to Meskwaki. They're like, oh, these guys are kind of tight-lipped about things. Maybe they'll share stuff with you. So William Jones goes, and he's sort of a complicated figure. They didn't get along with everybody, and they were like, who's this guy who's poking around, asking a lot of questions, and he's not a real expert, but everybody thinks he's an expert just because he writes things down. But he goes and he collects all these things, among them seeds. And even though he was trying to convince people that, he was really white and educated, he wrote little notes in the Meskwaki language on slips of paper and tucked them in all the little seed bags. And then his stuff gets sent off to the Field Museum. And then they say, now we want you to go to the Philippines and collect from the Ilongot headhunters. So he heads over to the Philippines, and he was kind of grumpy about being there, I think. And he had ordered a canoe, and he thought they were taking too long to bring things. He thought they were taking advantage of him. So the story, as I heard one version, he was like, I'm going to detain one of your elders. And so he grabs somebody's grandparent. Yeah, I see people shaking their heads, like, that's not going to go well. So they stabbed him to death. And that was the end of William Jones. Again, complicated character. This was in 1909 is when he collected these things. And his collections kind of get, his notes go one place and his stuff goes another place. And then nobody in this museum thinks about him for, 100 years. And so when I get the list from the anthropology collections and they're like, well, here's the seeds, I'm like, there's a whole bunch of seeds from Tama, Iowa, which is where the Meskwaki community is, who I had just been visiting for a different food summit. And I was like, they have a whole food sovereignty initiative. There are folks there who would be really interested in these seeds. Maybe they haven't seen them for a bit. And they were like, okay, lady, this still isn't a seed bank. I'm like, I know. So, but the museum softened over time and started thinking about, what is the purpose of a museum? Is it just to hoard things? Is it just to compulsively keep people's things? Or is there a new era coming, in my optimistic mind, of more collaborative experiences and purposes of museums? And so the following spring, these are some folks that came up from Meskwaki to visit with these seeds, who hadn't had any Meskwaki people to visit with in a very long time. And they pulled out the little pieces of paper and read the notes. And they were like, oh, well, the name of this bean means it's afraid to be too far away from the house. And so that tells you like how you have to plant this bean. And so this amazing picture in the bottom corner is later that spring, the museum agreed to send some seeds back. And they gathered some curators and they drove the seeds down there. And Jonathan Buffalo, who's the director of the Meskwaki Tribal Museum, was like, well, this is the first time you guys have ever come down here. Usually we have to go up there and demand our things back. And so this was kind of a flip of that. And so it was a really interesting process of people from the museum coming down there and visiting their collections and returning some of their seeds. So the first year they tried sprouting, they're 100 years old. And basically the way the seeds work is it's a baby with a lunchbox, just patiently waiting in there. And if you plant it right away, it has lots of lunch to give it the energy to burst forth out of its shell and send up its cute little leaves. And if you wait 100 years, it doesn't have a lot of lunch. It kind of gets tired and dried out eventually, which is what's complicated about keeping seeds in a museum next to like a mortar and pestle in a basket, right? So the first year they're like, no, we don't want to do anything, because we're like, well, we've got labs here, we can do this. And they're like, no, we want these to be treated like our seeds. And to the credit of the museum, they said, okay, you do it your way. They didn't sprout, because I think the seeds probably they're very geriatric. They need a little moisturizing, they need some Ensure to kind of boost up those. So this year, next month, folks are coming back up to the museum and this is going to be part of the exhibit, is this story. So the seeds sprout or they don't sprout, but it's kind of a really interesting exhibit about how can museums and communities visit with each other and come up with new stories. So we're going to try the seeds again. We've been working with a lot of different scientists, say, what is the full range? So what are some soaks they can be added? There are ways of scoring the seeds, maybe a little easier to bust out. There are ways of kind of testing the seeds. So we're going to visit with some of these elders and say, what are you comfortable with these seeds being exposed to? Anyways, I think I have gone over long in my excitement. But basically, to kind of conclude here, what does all this mean? That heritage seeds are an integral part of agriculture, because there's a big, culture is a big part of that word there, and the health and resilience of Native communities. And part of what I've been trying to drive home with this presentation is that efforts to protect seeds from being tampered with, from being patented, from being genetically modified, go beyond just being anti-science. So there was an article that came out late last year called Extreme Opponents of Genetic Modified Foods Know the Least but Think They Know the Most. And so it was all about the less you know about science, the more likely you are to be opposed to genetic modification. And as you can see, it's deeper than that here. It's all about a completely different worldview. Native people are not necessarily anti-science. They just have different ideas about how Western science can collaborate in a community way or take a lead from traditional environmental science. And a big important part of this is mending, creating, and restoring relationships. So you saw from all those different rematriation projects, you have connections being rebuilt and mending happening from the soil up between Indigenous communities and settler institutions or farmers or individuals. So this photo here, one of my favorite games when I'm hanging out with farmers is what's in your pocket right now? And it's usually so we got some Seneca striped sunflower seeds, we got some cranberry beans, we've got some potato beans there. And so this is Rowan representing the Indigenous Seedkeepers Network, and Ken Green from the Seed Shed. And also, in thinking about, how does this relate to some of your projects, I was looking at the Department of Landscape Architecture, the projects website, and there was one called A Right to Grow, a manifesto, that I thought really applied so beautifully to this. So this is your colleagues here, Kira Klingen and Carson Fisk-Vittori and Shira Grossman, and thinking about the current rhetoric around city trees assigns monetary value to their carbon absorbed, health benefits provided, rainwater caught, and aesthetic appeal. We critique the valuing of trees as a resource for human benefit. We must revalue trees as intentional, purposeful beings. So thinking about how are all the plant communities that we're interacting with thought about as intentional, purposeful beings, right? And how can you, in thinking about your design going forward, what does it mean to the very specific communities that you may be working with? How does it reflect their values or their food systems or the colors the grandmas like in their corn, right? So thank you very much. So I'll give a second for if people have to get up and go. I know you have classes and lives and other needs, but if anybody wants to stick around and ask questions, I will be here.
Thank you so much for a really extraordinary lecture. Earlier, you had mentioned that different seed keepers and farmers had different attitudes about financing for their agriculture and whether to use federal sources or not. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about what you heard.
Yeah, I mean, so there are some organizations, institutes, so like the Intertribal Ag Council, the IAC, came out of the Keep Siegel legislation. So essentially the USDA was discriminating against everybody. So everybody has a lawsuit. So you had the Pigford case where the African-American farmers won a settlement. There was and the Keep Siegel case was for Native American farmers. And so the Intertribal Ag Council was developed as a way of having an organized body to help tribal farmers to connect with USDA resources. So their whole attitude, and there's some really great people that work for them, are about like, all right, this federal money is out there and it should be going to Native farmers. How can we help Native farmers access that money? And then you have other people saying, I don't believe this federal government is ever out to be useful or helpful to me in any way based on historical precedents, and it's all going to crash at some point anyway. Like, so when this all crashes and burns, how independent can we be without that? So thinking about, some people will just take foundation money from foundations that they know are decent humans. Other people are like, there is no such thing as clean money. So there was really kind of a range of some people saying like, okay, this foundation is okay, but not this one because that president passed NAFTA and it ruined our fishing economy, so we're not going to let them put their name on our project. So that was kind of the range. It really went from, I'm going to take all the money I can get because our community really needs food, this is important, this is urgent, we need to just kind of move forward in any way we can, and other people saying, well, no, I want to do this in a very specific way with very specific partners.
Thanks for your talk. I was wondering if you could talk more about how this view that seeds are intentional beings, their ancestors to the tribes, how that impacts their adjustments to climate change.
Yeah, so this is the tricky thing that people are trying to figure out. So some people's response has been, okay, so Tara Lynn Brandt grows corn up at Six Nations, and she said, well, I'm saving some corn that does really well in drought years and some corn that does really well in wet years, and how can I kind of have a variety of corns, and how can I, make sure that the seeds that I'm working with can be adapted to a variety of things. Other people are talking about like, well, maybe we got to get to know our neighbors to the north and south, and does everybody trade their seeds north? Because as the climate is kind of moving and shifting, we're trying to guess who's going to have your climate in a few years. So Kyle White is a Potawatomi philosopher who is citizen band Potawatomi. His folks got relocated from Michigan to Oklahoma. He now teaches in Michigan, and he jokes that he went back to the homeland, and now the climate of Oklahoma is creeping toward Michigan. He's like, they're determined to keep me in Oklahoma. So there's concern, and this is, outside of farming, people, the Menominee, talk about what happens when the maple trees are walking out of their territory. So tribal boundaries are very fixed, and plants and animals are moving out of those boundaries. And so, what that's going to look like is really challenging. What that means for people's foraging and hunting and fishing rights, what that means for people's gardens, everyone's still trying to figure out, because the problem with climate change is that it's not consistent or predictable. So you don't know from one year to the next what to be prepared for, but that is something that people are concerned about.
Thanks. I was really interested in your distinction between damage-based research and desire-based research. I would love to hear more about how you sort of frame and understand your approach to desire-based research?
Yeah, so I would, if you haven't read Eve Tuck's article, I would definitely recommend it. How she lays it out, she said there's all this research about Native communities that demonstrates like, okay, yes, we have terrible education rates and teen pregnancy rates and diabetes rates and all of the, okay, we win the prize and all of the bad health. What does that then, at some point, what does that then do for you to just know that you always win the prize for having the worst statistics? Like, what do you do with that information besides feel defeatist and imperfect and sad and broken? So what she's talking about is desire-based research. How do you focus on what are people doing about those things? What are positive things that are happening in communities, and how can highlighting those things then inspire other people and make people feel motivated to want to emulate or join those people? So in the case of, not just focusing on like, oh, there's no land and there's all this climate change and all this diabetes, what are people doing about it, and what's working out there among what people are working on? Some things that I've gotten from reviewers from the previous book, from the, so I meant to put this up. So this is an article, You Can't Say You're Sovereign If You Can't Feed Yourself, that came out in the American Indian Culture Research Journal. And one of the reviewers wanted more like dirt on like what wasn't working in these projects. And I was like, to what end? Like, go gossip on your own time. I mean, so I understand that, people they don't want it to just sound rosy. Like, oh, that's great. Everybody's just, planting their corn every year and they're all getting along great and it's all magic. And so I do plan on talking about some of the challenges that people have consistently brought up, but then not leaving it at like that. So here are the challenges that people have brought up, but then what are some ways that people have gone about trying to address those challenges? So it's thinking, part of desire-based research is thinking about how is this project going to impact the people that you're working with and talking about. And so always being told you're the worst of the worst is, what does that do, as opposed to, elevating people who are working hard and doing a good job.
I work in the sustainable local food movement in general, and this talk was really focused on Indigenous communities, and I noticed you used the word gardening, not farming on and I think that might be because it's about feeding, again, smaller local communities, and these the emphasis is on getting these seeds back to where they came from. My question is, given that there is so much attention now being paid to local food movements in general, and given that those of us who are descended from European ancestors are not native here, has there been any work at kind of joining the local food movement, which is not Indigenous people for the most part, with the efforts of the Indigenous communities to rematriate seeds, and what are some of the tensions or issues to consider when working in that space?
Yeah, so as you saw in a lot of the different rematriation efforts, there are non-native allies involved in each one, and there are always people who are approaching me saying, okay, well, I've got land, how can I help? How can I? And so that's going to be a longer, more coordinated effort, because a lot of times people are like, I want to help, like send some seeds to me and I can grow them out, and sometimes that works well, and sometimes, people have different understandings about what should happen with those seeds. So just an example, there was a woman who, and I don't remember what state she was farming in, she was trying all of these different kinds of heirloom indigenous corns because she wanted to get chefs in the area interested in something different. So how do you create a market for this? And she thought she was doing, and she's doing all these test plots, and she had these YouTube videos. And then people whose corn she was growing there said, well, you never came and talked to us, you never asked us, so our name is still on this corn, and it makes it cute and it gives it cachet, but maybe we don't sell our seeds. And so that's been kind of some of the tension in some communities, that some people say, well, we shouldn't sell seeds. Seeds, if they're your relatives, if they're sacred in this way, you shouldn't sell them. Maybe if you make value-added food products, you sell that. So like the Pawnee project sells ground blue corn but doesn't sell seeds. And then other people say, well, if you expect people to put all of this effort into growing out all of these seeds and making seeds available to everybody, how do they pay their light bill? How do they, feed their families anything besides corn? How do they buy shoes? So there's all of these issues of how do you, in this particular economy, sustain the people who are doing the work. And if it's a community-based project, it's a lot of grant writing. And then when the grants don't come in, you live by the grant, you die by the grant, or they wonder, why are you not more economically sustainable? So that's some of the challenges that people really haven't. And it's going to be different from one community to the next, and one person to the next has different opinions. But I think in the situations where it has worked, it's been allied settler folks and Native community folks that have come together and done a lot of talking around what is our memorandum of understanding of what are people's obligations to these seeds or to these foods, what will be done with each of these seeds or foods, who gets a percentage of what, are things going to be sold, are they not, where do things go back to? So I think it takes a lot of discussing and patience and time.
I would like to follow up on that question. I mean, after all, we are in a school of design. Many people in the audience were people from the landscape, students from the landscape architecture department. And, going to this some sense of tension that might exist between, the exposure of this material, to other people different that don't belong to these communities. I wonder if there has been any example that you found in your research where that, most of the work that we do as landscape architects, it happens in the context of urban environments where, some of these material could have a different sense of visibility to create more sensibility toward this particular issue. If it does not just happen on the countryside, but it can reach in some way, I don't know which, that's why I'm asking the question, the urban sphere, in order to gain visibility and through visibility raise awareness and raise sensibility in most people. And I don't know, I wonder if there's any example that you can bring into.
Yeah, I don't have any photos in this presentation, but there's lots of Indians in cities too. So most cities have an urban Indian center, and a lot of the best urban Indian gardens were in Minneapolis. So there were examples, and especially this is where you really need a designer, because you have this small little plot, and it's how can we maximize? And so this is where often people were consulting with permaculture designers, or how do we get the maximum number of crops and still be able to get people? So the Muskegee Gitagan Garden in Minneapolis has this great corn spiral. And so it's this cool thing, and so you can kind of scush your way through, and then you're in the middle of it, and you don't even know you're in a city because you're just surrounded by all of these corn leaves. And the interesting thing there, they grow a lot of tomatoes and squash and everything else. They kind of grow an assortment of heirloom crops and others, but they do a karma market. So when they sell their vegetables, if there's a big fat tomato here, if you're a college professor making a decent paycheck, you should pay $5, $10 for that tomato. If you're a single mom trying to figure out how to feed your kids, you might pay 25 cents for that tomato. And so that's one of the ways that they've managed there. But yeah, a lot of the Portland had the Youth and Family Services Center had a little garden, the Little Earth Gardens also in Minneapolis. But I think especially in urban spaces, you need people who are kind of clever in visual ways to be able to collaborate with community members and say, how can we maximize the use of this space? Yeah.
Yes, so I was interested in what you were talking about, the Ponca planting corns, and how they use that in a way of resistance.
Yeah.
So have you come across other examples, and in what way can it be used to confront the legal system in an institutional way, or is it just bringing in more interested, so to say, stakeholders into the pot? So how does it work? And is this something that exists on a larger scale than just there?
Yeah, so one of the chapters in the book that I'm working on is thinking about how people from the food sovereignty movement have now come together with kind of anti-pipeline, anti-mining people to think about how do these extractive industry practices impact food sovereignty issues. So you had the example here of planting corn in the path of the pipeline. You had at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub, people thinking oh, this will be a bad look if they have to tear up our native seed garden to put this pipeline through. But then there's also been issues around protecting wild rice. So those are the examples that I can think of people planting, domesticated crops in that way. But up in Minnesota, Honor the Earth did pipeline rides for many years, so horseback rides across the state of Minnesota to draw attention to the landscape, that sandpiper pipeline was going to impact. And they continue to do that because now Line 3 is a pipeline there. Or over at the Bad River Reservation in Wisconsin, there was supposed to be a taconite mine that would have gone in upstream from them. And so community members took to the land and set up camps and did these, they called them heel camp, like harvesting, and I can't remember exactly, it was a couple of years ago, but they did harvesting camps, and they invited all kinds of people on the land to say, look, we're making maple syrup, we're picking mushrooms, there's all of these things that you could be doing with this landscape that will be destroyed when you put in this giant taconite mine, and all of the effluents from the mine are going to destroy the wild rice. And so there's been big pushes across the Great Lakes to prevent those things because of wild rice, and then in some of these other areas by planting the seeds in the way to say, like, no. And then even at Standing Rock, really the struggle there was about water, which is kind of at the root of all food sovereignty, seed sovereignty, life sovereignty. You need clean water. But I went to see what the kitchens were up to and to work in the kitchens. And there was a big push on some people's part to make sure those water protectors were being fed healthy food. So we brought in bags of wild rice that we had funded through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. And Brian Yazzie was bringing all these vegetables out of the Twin Cities and making sure that buffalo meat was being donated by these different tribes. So making sure that people who camped out there were eating well and eating traditional foods and thinking about that as part of their process of resistance, is taking care of yourself in that important way. Granted, the pipeline got ramroded through and there's been challenges since then, but I think that was an important takeaway when I interviewed chefs like a year later who had worked there, that was some of the important things that they were still thinking about was how do you make sure any movement is fed well with traditional foods?
Yeah, hello. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. Just to follow up on the questions about the urban environment, I was wondering if you think there's hope for urban population to have food sovereignty, like really in a large scale, not thinking about maybe designing from urban environments, farms, but really closing the cycle.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that when people are thinking about food sovereignty, some people get thinking on a small level, like some of the people I talked to were like, oh, our reservation is so small, we'll never be able to produce all the food we need on this reservation. Tribes never did that. People have been trading all over the place since people had neighbors. That of course you had to be pretty self-sufficient, but there's a reason why parrot feathers and chocolate and copper are found in shells. People were trading meat and fish, and so if one year you had a really bad corn harvest, you turned to your neighbors and worked things out. And so I think part of becoming food sovereign is having ethical relationships. Like, I don't want to give up chocolate. I like chocolate. Cacao is never going to grow here. But I have a great friend in Belize who's a Mayan chocolate guy who grows all of his own chocolate, and I've been to visit, and I feel like great eating his chocolate because I am supporting his operation and all those Mayan workers. And so thinking about, like, how do you develop good relationships with the people who are producing the things that you can't produce? So for people living in a city setting, how are the regions around the city being supported properly? How are those farmers being supported? How are the farm workers being supported? That kind of thing. Because often, like, when I give this talk, there's always like an economist lurking somewhere in the audience that is like, ha, how will we feed the world? Like, you people in your silly little seeds and your silly little gardens. And it's like, who's the we feeding the world, and how's that working out? There's distribution issues more so than production issues. And so how do we make sure things are distributed in an ethical way? How do you develop ethical relationships from producers to eaters?
Sovereignty definition has an idea of scale, and so that this is when there's a border between the globalization and urban environments and trade. They define it. How can we define it? You know what I mean? Yeah. The scale.
Yeah, I think the definitions of food sovereignty are up to each community and each individual. So when people ask me, like, well, how should we? It's like, no, like, how should you? You ask you. That I think it has to be up to communities to decide what those relationships look like. and how that works best for them. Yeah.
So I have a question regarding the nutritional value. And first, I just want to thank you for this presentation. It's very good. Have there been any comparisons between or among the heirloom seeds, for an example, and more contemporary seeds that you can buy now that are not GMO regarding the nutritional value between the
Well,
two?
in thinking about corn, corn is such an interesting and varied crop. Any corn you're going to get at a farm stand or in the grocery store has been bred at this point to be sweet and tender, and it doesn't have any protein, essentially. Whereas all the corns that I showed you today on these slides are very high protein corns, so they're very different nutritional compounds. There's a woman, Jamie Holding Eagle, who was working on a master's degree at North Dakota State, and she looked at the heirloom varieties that she had that were kind of passed through her family and tested the nutritional components compared to, other kinds of garden vegetables, and found them to be higher in a lot of the vitamins. Vitamin A was one of them, but thinking about the types of things they were growing out. So she found that, yes, these are more nutrient-dense foods, that other ones might be prettier, they might be resistant to one particular thing, they might be able to grow anywhere from Florida to North Dakota, these kind of other ones you get out of catalogs, but the ones that were developed right there have been selected for taste and ability to grow right there and were more nutritionally dense.
All right, last question.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. If we take the market as a basis of the distribution that we were talking before with the sovereignty and this global issue, no? Which is, or after all your exercise of traveling these 40 places or 20,000 miles, which do you think is the infrastructure which helps the best for distributing and to exchange? As I just give you an example, in Mexico there was 3 years ago a great governmental plan for creating in real small rural places this exercise of the gardening and being able to share. But a lot of these small towns, really like 30-person towns, they stopped doing it because there wasn't the infrastructure for being able to send their products or exchange. So I think the organizations are fantastic, but which have you seen here that have worked, and how, which one would be the best? Which market, or who's the one who's dealing it? No.
No, I think that's something that people are really trying to figure out right now. Just as an experiment, Dan Cornelius, who works for the Intertribal Ag Council, he did a mobile farmers market, and he started in Minnesota and got all stocked up full of like wild rice and Red Lake walleye, and he went down and he was setting up markets and trading it and then picking up beans in the Southwest and other things, and then he headed out to California and got more fish and picked out, and so he was doing it as a way of making people aware of each other's products and thinking about like how can we do those sorts of exchanges and things. But as far as like on a broader scale, not that I'm aware of, because a lot of times people say, well, how do I get access to these kinds of things? And most folks, aren't producing on a big enough scale. So even, some of the bigger scale projects I can think of, John Hinkwa in Wisconsin is the Wisconsin Oneida farm, and they have all this amazing, acres and acres of white corn, and they have a cannery that helps process it so they can put it in bags and they can sell it in their gas stations. You can go in and buy traditional foods, and in their little market. And at this point, people now have started eating more of it, which is amazing. And now they run out. And so other people are like, oh, we want some of that white corn. It's good that the community members are eating it up. But on a small community scale, that's been a way, having the farm and then having the cannery that can process it. Because to turn corn like this into soup, you have to boil it in an alkaline solution, then you have to rinse it, and it's a big production. And people are like, I get home from work and I'm tired and I don't have an entire weekend to make soup. So by having it already processed and in a bag, and you kind of dump it in a pot of boiling water, and you've got soup in a little while. They've been able to get people to eat more of it by having it packaged in that way. Yeah, it's plastic, but people are then eating more of the food. So on a community level, having like a cannery and then having it then driven to the different grocery stores and gas stations and one-stops has worked. But as far as getting it then out to other places, I think that's still something people are figuring out. Yeah. There was one, you had your microphone. Oh, did you take your microphone away?
last one.
Existential.
I mean, I was going to ask, just like from my own experience, I kind of looked at community health research, including like food sovereignty movements in Hawaii this past summer, and I was looking at also in the context of Asian settler colonialism there, and I was just wondering how, considering this is kind of personal, I'm looking into like working with a seed sovereignty organization this upcoming year in California, but I was really wondering how, you know, farmers of color in particular have like taken up this movement, because just the seed sovereignty organization in particular, for example, saves like Asian heirloom seeds, but how like farmers of color, like settlers of color, are working with indigenous communities so that you're working together and not, you know, having a movement apart.
Yeah, no, it's been a really interesting navigation of space and dynamics. You know, like Soul Fire Farm here in the Northeast has done this amazing work with African descended farmers and other farmers of color. There's been some other great organizations out of like Detroit, you know, the Growing Power movement. So there's been all of these really interesting, and so there's been interesting conversations about what does it mean to be more of an arrivant than, which is, you know, different if somebody brought you here under different conditions than folks that came on their own accord. What does that then mean to be a settler who's an arrivant and a settler of color who's had a very different history than many of the Euro-descended farmers who are working in some of these projects? And I think those are ongoing conversations, but I know there's been, and I can't think of the organization, but there's an organization in the Northeast that's been trying to think about how to collaborate with indigenous communities as part of that work, recognizing, you know, that, you know, whose land is your farm on, that you may have been brought here under very different circumstances than, say, the Norwegian farmers who are all over Minnesota, but still thinking about whose land are you on, and what does that mean to be collaborating with people.
Thank you so much. Let's give her another round of applause.